you know, we will have it for posterity, as it were.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
And I'm going to introduce our speaker today, Tristen Click. I had the pleasure of interviewing Tristen earlier today on Skype, and that'll be posted on the Ideal webpage eventually. So Tristen's originally from Seattle. She received her bachelor's degree from San Diego State. She has a diverse creative background from working with clients like the US Army, Google, commercial real estate, and sustainable energy companies. She currently works as a visual designer, working on translating complex information into easily digestible graphics. She recently earned her MFA in graphic design from Vermont College of Fine Arts. And this is the part where Chris puts his hand over his heart, because that's his alma mater as well. And the title of her thesis was Disembodied Senses. It explored sensory experiences and haptic interactions in relation to human connection. So we are very happy to have Tristen with us today, and I'd like to welcome her to Ideal.
Awesome, thanks for having me. I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen.
And just so folks know, Tristen's going to speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll open it up for Q&A. And go ahead and put your questions in the chat, and I will kind of be the interlocutor and pass them on to Tristen. And Tristen, if we're getting close to 4:45, I might, in a manner that I hope isn't too rude, kind of let you know that it's time to wrap up and time.
I tend to speak quicker than I intend, so we'll probably have extra time for discussion.
Excellent. All right, take it away.
All right. So hello, everybody. My name is Tristen, and I currently work at Deloitte as a visual designer. I also teach part-time at School of Visual Concepts in Seattle, and I'm excited to present with you today. Like Paul mentioned, this thesis work was originally presented in tandem with a physical exhibition last October at Vermont College of Fine Arts, where I met Chris. And the imagery shown in this presentation, I either used in the design of my book, posters, or the physical exhibition space. I've been changing and adding to my original ideas as I presented this research at different conferences and have had great discussions afterwards that have shifted or had me think about different questions. I'll share some insights from workshops and other resources that have inspired me along the way. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'll give new perspectives that have grown since the original pre-pandemic explorations I did. And then, as mentioned, plenty of time for Q&A and to discuss, because I usually, gain some great insights from there. And I'm just gonna tell you a little bit more about me, my background. So I think that some people have a specific moment in their life or career when they realize they're a designer. I don't consider myself one of those people. I had always enjoyed art classes through grade school, but never really excelled much or thought I was meant to be an artist. And for most of my life, I didn't really know what design was. But now looking back, I can identify some mile markers along my road towards becoming a designer. Remembering in high school, I can piece together clear signs that indicated I was headed toward a career in design. I remember sitting at the old PC monitor with a rounded, crappy, low resolution screen, editing things, and later learning MySpace and working backwards and stealing other people's code. I was always proud of my latest layout and really didn't like the pages full of tacky animations and bright colors and bad typography. And then in high school, I started taking design classes at the community college and learning Illustrator. And I just remember being proud of my first project and really loving that class. Just learning basic vector shapes, but I still had no idea what graphic design really meant. And so I started noticing typography and balance. And then when I joined the military, I continued working towards a career in design I made some really ugly logos, learned Adobe, finally felt like I was on the right track. I actually thought I wanted to be an architect before a designer, and then I realized you don't get to be Frank Lloyd Wright day one. You're doing a lot of math and engineering, and I was more, interested in the beauty and the design. And so now I try to focus on learning more than what I've been taught in books in school and want to challenge the way things have been done, taught, and passed down. And I want to land on new discoveries, points of view, and share them through art, design, and writing. So with that, I'll dive into the work. Disembodied senses, interaction beyond the screen. And I wanted to start with a quote that kind of helps put me in the mindset of physical interaction that I opened my thesis book with. So this is a Finnish architect, Juhani Plasma. I confront the city with my body. My legs measure the length of the arcade and the width of the square. My gaze unconsciously projects my body onto the facade of the cathedral, where it roams over moldings and contours, sensing the size of recesses and projections. My body weight meets the mass of the cathedral door, and my hand grasps the door pull as I enter the dark void behind. Experience myself in the city, and the city exists through my embodied experience. The city and my body supplement and define each other. I dwell in the city, and the city dwells in me. Designers communicate and build connections through their work. Immersive experiences can build connections by having no or low barriers to entry, creating layers of meaning, and engaging all of the senses. Connection, here defined as experience, learning, socializing, is one of the primary behaviors and drivers of human social behavior. Over the past decade, we've experienced a major paradigm shift in how we connect. One of the main drivers behind this change is advancing technology, primarily our reliance on smartphones and the internet. We have replaced physical connection with virtual connection, and while this has provided some societal advances and benefits, research shows this has also led to negative impacts on mental and physical well-being. Perhaps inevitably, technology will continue to advance at a rapid pace. Can we embrace this change while simultaneously being mindful of design methods for reconnecting physical and virtual beyond the screen through the use of full multisensory experience? Would this enhanced experience improve our sense of connection? As designers, we often limit ourselves to visual, form, texture, color, but we are surrounded by options for using mixed reality. Alexa, Siri, and other sources of conversational design, as well as advanced haptics, vibrating on our phones, for example, are cases in point. Memorable experiences tend to encompass all five senses. Experiences happen in the present and then evolve into memories. They involve objects, space, and psychology. They can juxtapose the good and bad. The five senses determine how people experience the world around us, while cognitive perception decides what that sensory information means and what people are made aware of. Interactive experiences within art and design can create a level of enjoyment that is different than simply looking at the aesthetics of a well-designed poster. They can create a different emotional impact. I was first drawn to researching haptic experiences because I wanted to understand why working with my hands gave me joy. I realized that interactive experiences within art and design gave me a level of satisfaction that was different than simply looking at the aesthetics of a well-designed poster. While reading Ellen Lupton's The Senses Design Beyond Vision, one notion resonated with me: design for the feeling of an idea. This statement reminds me of how, when I'm creating art, I am making it in an expressive way that I hope gives my viewer a particular feeling or evokes a specific memory. After researching and experimenting with touch and interaction, I also connected to this poetic excerpt from the senses. Touch is our first language, the first sense we acquire. Touch is our silent interface with the material world. Touch is the third dimension of surface that speaks to our emotions. Unconsciously, touch tells us whether to trust, whether to pull away, or lean in and embrace. Multisensory design can connect the audience emotionally to the work. If we expand further beyond visual and voice into touch, taste, and smell, can we improve our feeling of connection and well-being? In a visually overstimulated world, what would happen if designers more deeply considered all 5 senses? Furthermore, how exactly can designers prototype and create these experiences? Exploration of the idea of sensory and interactive design that incorporates technology began through experimenting with Makey Makey, an invention kit for everyone. For those who know next to nothing about programming, this tool allows users to learn and play. Makey Makey began as a project from 2 MIT Media Lab students who were inspired by other creative tools and invention kits using Scratch software, which is a drag and drop platform for coding. The creators believe that everyone is creative, inventive, and imaginative, and that everyone can create the future and change the world. My initial projects included a carrot piano, banana bongos. Other makers have created interactive maps, made game controllers out of Play-Doh, invented brand new games. Later projects I paired with Makey Makey, I started using conductive ink and created interactive posters. One piece I made recited parts of a poem as you touch different areas on the canvas. The emotional weight of the poem was increased when multiple places were touched and the lines of the poem audibly overlapped. Pairing spoken words with art created a new and engaging experience. Specifically in the thesis exhibition space, some of the experiential design incorporated technologies and others were more traditional. All senses were focused on. A smell station consisted of clear liquids where observers were invited to test their sense of smell through 6 different bottles with funnels. A potentiometer was used to trigger sounds when a person walked by a specific place in the exhibit. In the dark space, which is pictured here in the past few slides, there was scratch and sniff wallpaper and lights triggered by motion. My experimentation and research led me to discover the work of Ken Yuhara, a Japanese graphic designer, curator, and writer. In his book, Designing Design, he points out, sense-driven describes a situation in which progress pivots on our sensory perceptions. Let's pit this concept against that of the technology-driven world. Reviewing the world based on our senses would be sound and meaningful for technology as well. What about taste? For me, eating at a restaurant is a full sensory experience. The ambiance when walking into a place is created by sounds, smells, and the lighting. When the plate arrives, you first eat with your eyes. A beautifully plated meal could be described the same way as a piece of graphic design. The plate has balance, texture, and color. Next, the smell hits you, the aroma fills your nostrils, and you're ready to dive in. You pick up your silverware and the food touches your tongue. You are met with texture and finally, hopefully an amazing taste. You hear yourself chewing and might even vocalize, mmm. This is an image of scallops in a pea puree dish I made. I found graphic design foundations translate well to my food plating. By utilizing tactility in my art and design work, I've become more fully aware of the importance of touch. Not only do I enjoy the tangible when creating, but I appreciate when others touch something and have their own reaction. For example, forming a bowl on a pottery wheel, and then watching others pick it up and run their hands across it, appreciating small surface changes. We are in a technological age that accommodates our desire for things to feel as real as possible, and that's why the word haptics has become so popular when talking about creating cell phones or any virtual interface. Haptics simply means the data our bodies receive from touch. When a touchscreen vibrates as you press a button, it is giving your body haptic feedback, so you know you hit the button. Instead of focusing on color or form, perhaps designs can be driven by feeling and senses. During my thesis research, I did a few of my own experiments trying to create new observations. I've always found joy in the unexpected moments, outcomes, and perspectives that make one pause and reflect, or as Bob Ross calls them, happy accidents. The unexpected doesn't always mean new and groundbreaking experiences, but rather a perfect recipe of sensory inputs that create an unforeseen result. Nighttime and darkness have always heightened my senses and made me more aware of my surrounding environment. In Sensory Arts and Design, Nick Dunn writes that going out at night is a decisive act. The digital era has taken away darkness and decreased exploration through our bodily experiences. Many of us live in cities that never sleep. We can't see the stars in the sky because it is polluted with city lights. Night has a historical association with fear and dread, but night also conjures memory and can bring a sense of peace. What happens when we make the conscious decision to take a stroll at night versus the day? Do we gain a new perspective? What happens when we can't clearly see everything and we begin to rely on other senses? Dunn concludes, given that so much of our interaction with each other in the daytime is predicated on the visual, the denial of this at night, both optically and practically, means that we have to find new ways of connecting with and discovering our environment. So I did my own little walk at night in my neighborhood, trying to be more conscious of things around me. The darkness started to feel creepy as I noticed dark bushes along the alley, feeling like something could jump out at any moment. It had rained that morning for the first time in a while, so my footsteps sounded louder than usual because of the slightly wet ground. I could hear standing water slowly falling off a nearby roof. It was still cloudy and I couldn't see the stars, but as I passed streetlights, they put focus on the area they lit up. One corner had a fire hydrant under the bright spotlight, and I realized I had never noticed before its metallic silver color. Phenomenology is the philosophical study of structures of first-person experience, its intentionality, and relation to consciousness. Merleau-Ponty was a French philosopher who argued that participation plays a part in our perception of the world. Perception isn't just about visual terms. It's about the body's senses together, overlapping and creating intercommunication between us and our surroundings. I don't want to turn this into deep philosophy. Rather, I'm hoping to point out that we should not deny our own idiosyncratic sensory experiences when interpreting the world around us. We should be hyper aware of what our senses are telling us. We can do this by actively taking a walk at night, paying attention to our senses and what they communicate about our environment, stop separating mind and body, quit living in a manufactured reality created through our phones. Immersive and multisensory spaces make it easier to break down these barriers and force us to be present, even if only for a moment. Unfortunately, some barriers are hard to break down than others. A digital art collective called Team Lab created the world's first digital art museum in Tokyo. I had the pleasure of visiting it. Entering the space, one can interact with the art, influence it, and be fully immersed in another world along with other people. There are physical structures, digital projections, LED lights, and sounds. The scenery is always changing in each room, so no one ever sees the same exact thing twice. The museum is called borderless because the art moves freely from world to world with no boundaries. Visiting this space was very inspirational to me and definitely influenced my work. Here are a few more photos from when I went. Why do these spaces make us feel like we're in another reality? There's more than one reason people are drawn to experiences that make them feel blissfully in another world. Google's dictionary defines escapism as the tendency to seek distraction and relief from unpleasant realities, especially by seeking entertainment or engaging in fantasy. Living in a high-stress socio-political climate can make us want to shut our brains off and escape the harsh realities of the world. Escaping to different mental and physical places can be therapeutic. Multisensory spaces can make it easier to break down barriers and force us to be present. As designers, we should continue to make an effort not to separate mind and body in order to create experiences that spark new, memorable connections or convey a meaningful message. This is a picture of the Makey Makey I mentioned if you're not familiar. While this graduate thesis work was primarily a study incorporating sensory activities into a teaching practice has expanded opportunities for employing simple methods and tools that can be used for prototyping sensory experiences, both in the classroom and in one's design practice. Classroom methods have included an interactive poster workshop using the Makey Makey. I've done this at the I/O Festival, at the Otis College of Art and Design, and Arkansas State University. One workshop focuses on using tactile tools and supplies, such as foil, conductive ink, and Play-Doh to create interactive experiences and add another layer of depth or understanding by focusing on more than just the visual aspects of the poster. This could be serious, experimental, or playful. One lighthearted result ended up being a 24x36 Minesweeper game poster. You just see here. So as you clicked each of those foils, it would either give you a sound of winning or blowing up. Because of humans' over-reliance on vision, it's easy to forget how strong and important the sense of smell is. A study in 2014 showed that humans can distinguish more than 1 trillion odors. People might not be aware of these instinctive smelling abilities because they don't have the language to describe that many smells. And they often don't even realize they are picking up a smell. Some organizations have started to utilize smell, like certain Canadian paper smelling like maple syrup, their currency in dollar bills. But aside from government branding, how else can the subtle power of smell be used for creating an engaging, meaningful experience? This quote from David Abram, the author of The Spell of the Sensuous, sums up how important our physical bodies are to our mindful connection to the world. Yet consider, without this body, without this tongue or ears, you could neither speak nor hear another's voice, nor could you have anything to speak about or even to reflect on or to think, since without any contact, any encounter, without any glimmer of sensory experience, there could be nothing to question or know. Culture Track is a cultural innovation engine dedicated to addressing the most pressing challenges facing the worlds of culture and creativity through research, education, dialogue, and action. They believe that studying and tracking the shifting patterns of audience behavior is critical to shaping the future of culture. They conduct these research studies based mainly on changing behaviors, and according to a few of their reports, this was from 2017, the top motivators for cultural participation were fun, interest in the content, and experiencing new things. This lined up with the explanation of why unique places like the Museum of Ice Cream are becoming so popular. It is inviting for objects to be human scale, allow use, be touchable, and tell stories through all the senses. Learning from these reports and studies gives insight to how design can best connect to changing interests of audiences. It's unfortunate that most designers spend the majority of their time on the computer and rarely have other multisensory experiences. Striking a balance between work on the computer and away from it can be rejuvenating. After a long day of design work, one might cleanse the palate by working with one's hands, cooking a meal, painting, throwing pots on a wheel, and many other practices, and emerge feeling more fulfilled. Experiential graphic design methodology helps open the door to multisensory activation. To successfully relay a message to any audience through graphic design, there should be no prerequisites. You don't have to know anything about anything special in order to appreciate the Museum of Ice Cream, as opposed to many other traditional museums. This is not to say that such a museum is better than something like MoMA or the Met, but investigating the popularity of these experiences can help influence design work and motivate designers to consider all the senses in their work, rather than simply vision. There's a gap between physical and digital spaces. Many companies are creating digital enhancements for bodies that change our perceptions. For example, Fitbit, Amazon Alexa. Designers can use these advancing technologies to create physical, multisensory experiences and help bridge the gap. Emotional intelligence is an important layer in human experience that can decide whether or not something engages or resonates with us. Business and technology leaders are using the similar thinking, implementing things like eye tracking and voice recognition in their human experience platforms. The implication for designers and educators is to understand how new sense-oriented approaches to traditional design deliver a powerful message that might resonate more deeply with viewers. While this thesis that initiated the work focused on personal design and research, a new goal is to bring these tools and thoughts to the design classroom. The practices used in experiential graphic design can help introduce students to a future-proof practice. Incorporating multidisciplinary design disciplines can improve human experience through richer and more meaningful interactions. Can designers shift their thinking to incorporate practices found in immersive art installations into the design process? Can designers create multisensory experiences to communicate specific messages? Can immersive experiences build connections? Simply put, yes, designers can do all of these things. Sense-driven design pushes people to feel rather than think. The connections built through sensory experiences can become more powerful than traditional and old ways of connecting and expand designer roles. By realizing that much of society is seeking connection, designers can think more empathetically in their design practice. They can use their 5 senses and their observant minds to create lasting impressions and make people look and think differently about things. As noted, immersive experiences can build connection by having no or low barriers to entry and engaging all of the senses. Artists and designers are communicating and building connections through their work. Messages can have layers of meaning that can be interpreted through different senses. Design should be about awakening the senses and shifting people's view of the world and how it could be. I live in Seattle, one of the earliest US cities to be hit with COVID-19 in February. Pre-pandemic, I found that our screens could often make us feel less connected to those around us. Since COVID swept our country, technology has become just the opposite. It's now the way we keep in touch with our community. Through the lens of my thesis topics, I found myself pondering how our senses are being impacted by social isolation measures. I started taking note of personal observations as I did with each sense while researching my thesis. Vision. As masks started being worn in public, I realized I was no longer looking at what I recognized as human faces. It's a hard thing to explain or notice that for 30 years, my brain has been distinguishing human faces as just that. And now my brain is recording face masks. The first time in the grocery store, the shelves were ever empty, I realized I had never seen anything like this. Sound. While this was less drastic at first, I remember having a moment while driving on a usually packed highway. My windows were down, and I suddenly noticed the absence of all the road noises I had grown so accustomed to. As schools closed and unemployment rates went up, I heard sounds during the day in my house and in my neighborhood that were never there before. Smell. I have a very sensitive nose, so when I first started wearing a mask, I realized I was picking up less of the normal aromas I notice. On the opposite end, I started smelling cleaning agents and hand sanitizer everywhere I went. At this point, I think I could do a blind smell test and let you know when a person had just used sanitizer is walking towards me. Taste. While this might seem not as majorly impacted as the other senses, eating hot and fresh food at restaurants versus ordering takeout is a much different experience. Taking restaurants one step further, sitting down with a meal with someone can be an intimate experience. Ironically, temporary loss of ability to taste and smell is one symptom of COVID-19. Touch. This is probably the most obviously impacted sense that did not take heavy observation to immediately notice. Meeting new people was suddenly met with an awkward wave versus a standard handshake. Greeting friends and family 6 feet apart felt less intimate. I found myself asking these questions. Can we share a sensory experience virtually? How can we fill that sensory void? More directly related to education, how do we keep connection in this online Zoom environment? I don't have all the answers, and I wish I did. I'm doing my best to observe and reimagine how I've done things before. I try to bring tactile exercises into the online classroom environment. One icebreaker my class did was to draw with pen and paper the animal they were feeling like and explain why. I'm hoping to have a virtual dinner party at the beginning of one of the classes where everyone can bring food and talk and collaborate. I also posed the idea of everyone creating by hand a postcard and mailing it to each other as a piece of physical connection. While I don't have all the answers, I do know that paying attention to the individual sensory input we experience can help us stay in the moment and focus on the things we can control. This new pandemic reality has increased our anxiety and isolation. So finding ways to cope by focusing on all of our senses has never been more important. And that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tristen. I was just furiously jotting down notes the way I always do when we have ideal speakers, because they always look at the world so differently than I do. And I always get inspired by so many ideas. And that was certainly true of your talk. So thank you very much. Since we do have 28 participants, I'd like, so we don't all kind of talk over each other unintentionally, I'd like to ask members of the group to type messages into the chat that I can relay to Tristen.
And I'm also happy to share, if anybody thinks of anything after the talk, certain resources, links or books or anything that I mentioned or presented.
While I'm waiting for something to come into the chat, I was wondering if you've thought of any like health therapy applications of your work.
Yeah, I've actually thought about, so in art therapy, kind of why is painting number one? If you like Google art therapy, or the thing that's used most. And like I mentioned in pottery, I had never done pottery before. And if I was having a stressful day at work or just frustrated with something else on personal life, and I would go in and do pottery and then come out, I would feel like I just went to therapy. So I think for sure within, maybe scratch and sniff wallpaper, going in and smelling something citrusy, maybe that changes your mood, or lavender or whatever it is. I think that all of these can definitely impact that.
Great. I'm starting to get some questions via the chat. Shally asks, you use the phrase future-proof. Could you explain what you mean by that and how you conceive of that for educating students?
Yeah, so future-proof, meaning that when we're teaching design students, we're giving them ways to be future-proof designers. And so I guess what I mean is, if I give this workshop, they're not necessarily going to be using the makey in all of their designs. It's more about training them to think and adapt and research new technologies, which, while I very much enjoyed my undergrad experience, I feel like that was lacking. Kind of, we took our very basic, like InDesign, Photoshop, Illustrator, and these very traditional things, but not really transforming my brain to be always adapting, learning more, and thinking about more than just what I was designing on that screen. And then also on AIGA, they have some like future-proof design topics, I think is what they call it. And it's things like technology, and a lot of things I talked about, like the good and bad sides of technology, digital inclusivity and accessibility. So that's kind of what I mean by future-proof.
Great, thanks. Jenny asks, does the inclusion of different sensory experiences in the class improve performance or attention?
Yes, in the workshops, kind of going into, so specifically the one at Otis, so they're a 6-hour lab class for their master students. So I can imagine that that can be a lot of hours to stay focused normally, maybe if it's like lecture, or even if you break it up by working on projects. And I feel like the time just flew by. Everybody was collaborating the whole time. Everybody stayed on task. Everybody was excited. When we presented, there wasn't a lot of, I don't know how easily distracted sometimes people can get when they're just, doing one thing, and everybody was kind of encouraging each other to do the next steps and working collaboratively.
Got an interesting question from John. He says, a lot of what was said reminded me of what was said about psychedelics in terms of creating emotional states. Would you comment on this possible connection and whatever else might be said about tech as a drug?
Yeah. So I'm not saying we should give acid to our students. But I totally think tech is a drug. Everybody sees the addiction and these emotional impacts that we get right away. And when I was thinking about my own issues, I'm sure we've all done this. We like have our phone in our pocket and we think it vibrates, and then we look and there's not a message. Like, that's not a good thing. So in creating emotional states, I think that can be the bad side of technology. And then, there's also the good side, like, things like the makey and pairing technology with ways that we can engage in a good, emotional, and impactful way.
While I wait for other questions to come in on chat, can you talk a little bit about, you talked about the emotional weight of a poem, where the person interacted with the poem. That was fascinating to me, but I didn't really pick up on what you really meant, or how that was realized. Could you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. So it was a poem about suicide. So like I mentioned, these posters could be playful, serious, anything like that. And sometimes when you're sitting there reading a poem, sometimes the emotional weight hits you, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes it's different ways. And so I had recorded myself reading parts. So as you touched, it would be reading it to you. And when you started touching different places, different lines of the poem would overlap, and you'd start to hear certain words or different emphasis, and it just hit you deeper, I guess, hearing all that overlapping and reading, and kind of brought a different side to it, and an effect that I didn't necessarily see happening.
Amazing. That's so cool. We've got a question about the Makey tool. Could you explain a little bit more about that, what it is and how you use it?
Yes, so a 5-year-old could use it. It's really easy. That's why I like bringing it into the design classroom, because some people, know everything about coding and are very up with technology, and others are maybe more traditional designers. So basically, there's just like little metal alligator clips, and you hook it to anything conductive. So my first project was a carrot piano. So I had these 5 chords, and I connected them to different parts on the carrot. To 5 baby carrots. And then through the MIT Scratch program, which is the drag and drop coding, basically you do if-then statements. So you drag, if I press 1, then this sound comes out. So then I would pick the sound that matched with like the piano. So in the Minesweeper example, they would pick the bomb sound or the da-da sound. And so that is a really easy thing to learn. And there's a lot of YouTube videos of different ways that people create things. And some people, students will be maybe like, oh, this was really easy to learn, but like, what if I want to do these 6 things? So maybe when I touch it, a robot arm comes out and it says something. And, when you get to that level, you want to go to something like Arduino or Raspberry Pi or any of those more complex computing things. But the Makey is awesome. I know that like Girls Who Code has used it before for younger classes when teaching students how to think about code. Yeah.
Thank you. We're getting lots of questions now. This is great. Thank you, everybody. We are at the doorstep of the emotional web, unsolicited interactivity with AI such as Alexa or Siri, where they use the sensors in our devices to read our moods or emotions and then offer suggestions that can be timely, practical, useful, or even save your life. How do you feel about the use of engagement of our senses to create a relationship with AI?
I definitely think it's happening, and it's going to happen more. So like eye tracking right now, like what are our eyes looking at, and it responding to that. I don't know. I feel like having your phone burst out a scent probably isn't going to happen, like maybe not to that level of it. But I definitely think that senses are and will be used. And when things are responding, they're going to focus more on what hits the emotional impact for you. So maybe that is a physical vibration paired with a sound, paired with a pop-up, like whatever kind of things, I guess, grab your attention, which to me, in my experience, is having more sensory responses. I think they'll be using to grab.
Got another kind of therapy related question here. They say that music truly can help patients with dementia to help bring back their memory. Have you done any work with the elderly to see how this might affect them?
No, but that is something I thought about because one of the Makey projects that I saw, someone with a disability, they had created a program for them to use through the Makey, which was easier for their hands to use. So I wonder I think about things like this, like if they had a picture of a family member and when they touched it, a certain song played and maybe that was associated with them, like, would that help their memory? For me personally, it would. When I'm trying to memorize things, I tend to make a song out of them. A lot of us do when we're, kids and learning. But I think that would be really cool research to see if when your brain is actually impaired, like dementia, if that has the same effect or helps at all, even if it's a little bit. Someone do that and let me know.
How can we make sensory experiences accessible to those who struggle with mobility, vision, hearing, and other senses?
Mm-hmm. I think that, so let's say that you're visually impaired. I think focusing on physical, smell, sound is going to help with the accessibility. The other way around, I guess, if you can't smell something, ramping up the other senses or changing things. I read a study that there was a wine tasting and they did it when the room was pitch black and they did it when it was lit up, and they actually got different tasting notes on things. So I think knowing what the impairment is and emphasizing the other things can help that interaction. Sometimes I wonder if because I'm really blind without my glasses, if maybe that's why I enjoy like tactile experiences more, because I have a visual impairment. I don't know. I think about that too.
And I'm going to read a question, and excuse me if I read it incorrectly because I'm not sure of the capitalization. How do you feel about the use of, it's either this engagement or THIS, which stands for something I don't know, but that the person asking the question does. How do you feel about the use of THIS, engagement of our senses, to create a relationship with AI?
I think that comes down to ethics, which it depends on whose hands it is in. So if someone's using, sensory design and AI to make us believe what they want to, probably not a good thing. If it's, hopefully we can get to a point where we're keeping companies and things in check, and using AI and machine learning and all of that to be on the positive side and think about those sensory relationships. But how do I feel about it? It's kind of, like I said, the good and bad side of technology. It can go either way, and it's kind of scary to think about.
Yeah, and then we've had some witty exchanges in the text about Alexa. Okay, here's one. I would venture to say that associating pictures with familiar voices or other sounds with pictures will help some folks with memory issues. Associations help individuals with brain injuries remember things. Whether it would work with dementia is yet to be discovered. So I think that was picking up on our thread that we examined earlier.
Yeah, I think that would be fun to research. And then let's say you went to like a local senior center and like did this on your own. I'd be interested to know how many, what the sample size would have to be to actually see a change. If you had 10 people with dementia and half of them started having a little bit better memory, and then how long, like, okay, so the week you go back, but what about like in a year as it gets worse? It would be really cool research. Someone's got to be doing that.
What are the, who have you worked with most? I mean, I see like associations with therapy, psychologists, sociologists. I mean, it seems like your work could intersect with so many other disciplines. Mm-hmm. Who have you worked with most often?
Most often other designers and educators. The more like philosophical psychology, that side of it has been me thinking, okay, I get this feeling when X happens. Why is that happening? Is it just me? Is it in my head? Is there a reason for this? And then reading things like the art and sensory design, when Nick Dunn talks about the darkness being a decisive act. And then I'm like, well, what actually happens? Why am I feeling that way? And going out there and doing that myself. So mostly designers and educators, but I, pull and research. I'll take one little piece and kind of go down a deep hole.
Got a question from our philosopher. Why the title Disembodied Senses? What does the dis do?
Yeah. So I kept going back and forth between the title of my thesis to be embodied senses or disembodied senses, and kind of the definitions of those. Did I have the definitions in there? So on the first couple slides, I had one as embody. So that's to make concrete and perceptible. And then disembody, to divest of a body or corporeal existence or reality. So when you're having an embodied experience, you're having this, like when I'm touching this, it's a concrete, perceptible thing. And then a disembodied experience is kind of like the mental like in the Tokyo labs, like when I felt like I was in another world or in fantasy or not the same reality. And I kind of kept going back and forth about what am I talking about? And I was talking about both. So I came up with the disembodied senses. So dis or embodied senses.
What's an example of a low stakes sensory design exercise in a classroom that would engage students without requiring advanced technical know-how?
Honestly, the makey makey is so easy. I would say that if we didn't want to do something technology related, I know that people make their own like scratch and sniff stickers out there, and there's like YouTubes on those. And that was something I researched. And then another thing I was going to try to do, but it wasn't long lasting, was lickable wallpaper inspired by Willy Wonka.
Willy Wonka, yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, when you go to like the grocery store and you get a cake that has the printout on top, so that you can just print on that paper and then you can take any kind of extract and put it on there. So when you lick that shape, that's a taste you get. And so that wasn't very sanitary for a large exhibition space. And it also didn't hold for more than like a day. But I kind of just try to think about what sense I'm focusing on. And if I'm doing a non-technical aspect, how to do that. But really the makey makey is so easy. It would take you 5 minutes to learn.
Just really quickly, how do you spell makey makey?
Makey, Makey.
Okay, gotcha. That was one of the questions. Can you speak to how the democratization of content creation changed the relationship between educators and students, between doctors and patients, and so on? That's a pretty heavy question.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give it a couple seconds to digest that one.
So in my personal experience, it's changed the relationship because I will have a student send a link in like the group chat and be like, oh, I read this here, or oh, I read that here, and just finding kind of random article pieces that are maybe somewhat related to what I'm teaching, but not really. And I guess students can go out and find their own information now, but I think it's hard for them to know that they're finding, you know, what we think is like the right information or the right time or a reliable resource. And I think it's kind of the same with doctors and patients. Like, you know, if my foot hurts and I go to WebMD and start looking up why, and then I go to the doctor's office and I'm like, no, actually, I'm pretty sure I have cancer. Like, I think that, you know, having all of this content out there has changed that. And then also the students or patients can create this. So someone can, you know, create an article on Medium about typography that might be totally wrong as well. So that's been interesting in content creation.
What effect do you feel the sense deprivation will have on newborns during this COVID time? Touch, the outdoors, crowds, etc. Are there products or suggestions to increase senses to our youngest?
That's interesting. So I actually went to sense deprivation tank too during all of like this research. And then another thing that I read talked about how as when we're babies and we're born, before we can see, taste, smell, or anything, touch is the first language. And then as we start to age and lose our vision and taste and hearing, touch is like our last to go. So just from that research, I think anything touch related, touching a soft blanket, touching other things as far as like a baby would help with that since they aren't interacting with other people as much. And obviously no one wants to sit their baby in front of a screen for 8 hours a day, probably. So I think focusing on touch is really important. And then I don't have kids, but I know as they progress, they can start to taste other things. So maybe there's some kind of like teaching there with like taste and relating it to color and touch and things like that.
Okay, we're at about 4:56. So unless somebody types a question really fast. Oh, here is one. Just when you thought you were off the hook, Tristen. How does your work connect with the Americans with Disabilities Act?
So it doesn't directly or officially, but in a lot of my research, I've read how these sensory interactions can help people with disabilities. So like I mentioned before, someone had made basically a controller that someone who didn't have full mobility of their hand was able to use, and that was through the Makey Makey, so they could like switch channels on their TV with what their hand was able to do. And then I think, you know, starting to think as not vision as our number one thing. Disabilities, accessibility, all of that's more important. And thinking this way has made me realize that someone who does have a disability in one of their senses appreciates and pays more attention to this. One of the other people who went to VCFA, she did an experiment with people with visual impairments shopping because they don't know what looks good together, right? And so she had little shapes on the clothes so that they could close their eyes and feel. And so like this top would go with this bottom, or this would relate with this. So I think that type of thinking can definitely help with any type of disabilities or impairments.
Just getting lots of thanks for joining us in the chat. Textural granimals. Yeah. Chris is always good for some verbal gymnastics. Anyway, thank you so much, Tristen. This has been mind expanding and very useful. I think you've given us lots to think about. So is it okay if I share your email with people who might want to follow up with you?
Yep, of course.
Okay. So that pretty much concludes our presentation for today. So let's all give a virtual big round of applause to Tristen. Yay!
Thank you, and thanks for the great questions.
Yeah, that's a great range of questions. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating. So I am going to sign off, and we will see you guys next week. Ideal people, we're going to have another speaker, Robin DeRosa, who's a nationally recognized speaker on OER, Open Educational Resources. So we shall see you later. Thank you again, Tristen, and
Thanks,
farewell.
Tristen.
Thank you.
Thank you.